Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
To the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Emmet Wyman. I'm back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be kicking it with you and riding and rocking through this entire football season. That's going to be different than none other season in the National Football League, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be a season that's just for the ages, but I don't think you could say that in a good way. This is going to be a season that's just insane, and the number one thing you need to be is prepared. So that's what this podcast is for, to investigate and educate. Let's get into the news first, but stick around later. We're going to get into how to really build a draft board and what you need to do in order to build the draft board and how to use that draft board come draft time in the next segment. And then later on, I want to get into not only rankings in terms of these players, but I want to get into bounce-back players. This is something that I was interested in. Bounce-back players are players basically that were projected to do really well last year and flopped, but this is the year that they could be on the up because they got to redeem themselves. They have that hunger now. And we'll get into that later, but in the next 4 podcasts, which will be these next 2 weeks, I mean, is really the biggest fantasy football draft season. I figure why not? Why don't I give you my top 10 quarterbacks, my top 10 running backs, my top 10 receivers, and my top 10 tight ends. All right, and really break it down in order for you to get, a general consensus of what you should do in the early rounds if you don't know what to do there. Because if you're going to, mess up one part of the draft, you better be the later rounds. You better have those early round picks correct. So that's how you're going to win in fantasy football. But the goal, obviously, is to have every pick correct, if that's possible. I've never done it before. If somebody does, then you're a genius. I don't know what to say. Maybe you should go work in the NFL. But let's get into the news, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, this has been really a dry week, I would say. It's the last week before training camp. Training camp, yes, it's starting this week, but you're not really hearing the whispers of a normal training camp. You're hearing, this guy looked good, this guy looked good. I mean, that's every year. Everybody's looking good in training camp. We talked about this last podcast. It's basically because there's no pads. Nobody's hitting. The windows are wide open. Nobody's playing tight coverage. The quarterback is having all day in the pocket because nobody's going to hit the quarterback. So everybody's looking really good. It's basically, flag football. That's what they're playing. They're not even playing tackle. They're playing flag. So it's just going to be a training camp that, for the most part, is strength and conditioning, and obviously for the new teams with new coaches, like Dallas Cowboys, Washington Redskins, Carolina Panthers, and a couple other teams. They're going to have a long way to go because they got to get a new system installed and have all this COVID and make sure the players are in the tippy-top shape. So it's just going to be a long ways to go in terms of having your work cut out. And the Rams are going to be there in I think less than a month for Sunday Night Football for teams like Dallas, and then the season's going to be here before you know it. Is what I'm trying to say. So teams are basically they're scrambling. We'll get into Hard Knocks in a little bit, and that kind of gave you a little peek at what I was trying to talk about last season. I was really emphasizing how how different this season is going to be. I mean, I love talking about, guys, I go on and on about rankings and this and that, but I mean, players' health is going to be something that matters so much this year that you're going to have to do extra research that you didn't want to do before. You're going to have to, if one of your players on your team gets COVID, you're going to have to follow that throughout the whole season. And the protocol is going to be all over the place. I mean, now it seems like, okay, guy goes home for 10 days, 2 weeks, he comes back. Then what if another guy gets it? What if another guy gets it like maybe a week after that guy comes back? They're going to think, oh, maybe that player came back and, he still had it and he spread it. You like this. But let's not try to get too off track with that. But you understand what I'm trying to say. This is going to be a ridiculous season. September is going to be ridiculous in terms of how just sloppy things are going to be from not only a football perspective, but just from an organizational standpoint. I mean, there could be some games getting canceled. So you see that in NBA, you've seen that in MLB, you've seen that in hockey. Why wouldn't it happen in the NFL, right? Or it's not like the NFL is that much better. I mean, they make a lot more money, but they don't make them better in terms of organization. So we've seen this before in terms of mishaps. We've seen it with the freaking replacement referees. Remember that? They were too cheap. They didn't want to pay the refs. They brought in these guys. You saw how that was, right? That was something that could have easily been fixed. This is something that's way beyond it. So this training camp is just it's going to be one that's going to favor the veterans. If you're looking at it from a fantasy perspective. So what does that mean? This year, as much as I want to, if there's a rookie not picked in the first round or second round, maybe like a running back like Jonathan Taylor, he might be the exception. But if there's rookies have no shot this season. Like, coaches are going to go with veterans no matter what. They know the playbook. They know what they expect as a pro. You're not going to really have to teach them much. You're going to have to do grooming. With a rookie, you're going to have to teach. And I think the coaches are going to rely on the players to really help them out. But at the same time, the players, they're thinking, hey, I'm competing with this guy, so I don't know how much I'm really going to want to help him. I might want to just, start my games, get my money. I don't see the rookies having any leverage whatsoever unless, a Henry Ruggs in Oakland. I mean, he could start on that team. John Gruden will put you on the field if you got juice, and he got a lot of juice, so he'll start. But you look at maybe Jefferson and Minnesota, Ray Gore with the Eagles ain't going to be playing early. There's just some guys that I don't see a chance in terms of, the usage. Wide receiver 3, a flex option. Don't see it for these guys. So little stuff like that's going to affect them. But at the same time, these veterans are much more prone to injury. So they go down, the rookies are going to go up. So there's just something more in the season that you're going to have to, you got to keep 4 eyes on your fantasy football waiver wire this year, guys, if that's possible. I know for every human it isn't, but what I mean by 4 eyes is notifications. Listen, it may seem ridiculous, but you want to be on top of it if you think you're going to win your league. If you're competitive and you want to win your league, you want to be the very best. That stuff is essential. Believe me. So, let's get into Cam Newton. I know a lot of people are like, we heard about Cam Newton already. He's in New England. But what is Cam Newton's fantasy stock? That's something that's really been a question mark because this is training camp, and we're looking at Patriots training camp. What's the one question they got? Who's their quarterback? I mean, 90% chance at least Cam Newton's going to win the job. I don't see Jared Stidham taking it from him. And more importantly, what Cam Newton has a leadership quality that when he gets in that locker room, guys are going to like him. And Tom Brady couldn't do that. That's not saying Tom Brady's a good not a bad leader. Tom Brady's 40-something years old. I mean, he could be some of these guys' fathers. Seriously. Like, it's the relationship is just not there in terms of the way he can bond with the players like Cam can. Cam has this charisma, and I mean, it's really just leadership, great leadership that will sway these players to like him, favor him, and follow his way. So that's automatically he's going to be the starter. But what does that make him in a Bill Belichick offense? Now, we assume that the medicals check out. We assume that pretty much he's going to be good to go. Knee's fine, ankle's fine, whatever it was. He's back to 100%. Does he have the same, I don't know if you want to call it athleticism or just Superman abilities that he did in 2015 when he won that MVP? I mean, that's something that I don't know if he'll ever reach that, but Bill Belichick might give him the best chance of doing that. So this is something that Cam Newton, his stock to me, is just all over the place. I mean, now I see people that say, take him round 11, round 12, because obviously he's not going to be a high round pick. Because what if he gets back to, he has the rush in him. He had a year off, so what if he becomes a good rushing quarterback again? And he gets 6 touchdowns on the ground, and then maybe 25 to 30 passing. That's a great quarterback for fantasy. That's a great quarterback if you can get that in the late rounds. So he's just a name that really intrigued me, and especially with this training camp coming back. I mean, him in New England is, I mean, honestly, him in New England might be more curious than Tom Brady in Tampa. Maybe they're 50-50, but still. I mean, it's Cam Newton in New England is going to be something that every fan is going to watch, because with his accolades combined with Bill Belichick's accolades, you expect one thing, and that's a ring. And you'd also expect a good offense, which is something New England these past 2 years have not been. They have not been a good offense. It's been slow. They haven't had anybody over the middle. Gronkowski hasn't been productive last year he wasn't there, and the previous year he was hurt. So he hasn't been productive at all. The guys they're trying to bring in to replace him are kind of Edelman's getting older now, so he's not as shifty as he used to be. N'Keal Harry's the kid they drafted from Arizona State. He's a fantasy sleeper that I might talk about later. If he stays healthy, that might be a fantasy sleeper. Because I could see Cam Newton easily bonding with him and getting on his good side. And all of a sudden, boom, that's your number one receiver, number one quarterback duo. And they're going to ride the hot wave with that. That could make a lot of points, guys. So keep an eye on that. And keep an eye on Cam Newton. But let's get into, before we get into the meaningful stuff, quote unquote, right? Let's get into Hard Knocks. Now, let's make one thing clear about what Hard Knocks is trying to portray. It's the same message that I just did the past 10 minutes. This season is not your typical NFL season. On Hard Knocks, usually in the first day, like last year you saw Antonio Brown on the hot air balloon. Then you saw that with Melvin Ingram's pulling up in his whatever kind of go-kart that thing is. But you saw guys pulling pranks, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And you don't see that this year. I mean, there's not a lot of, hooting and hollering, and guys are out here pushing and shoving each other, high-fiving, this and that. I mean, this is, let's put our mask on, let's get to work. And this could benefit the players in terms of just the attitude they need for the season, that this is all serious, this is all business. I mean, yeah, definitely you could have fun, but, still, let's, training camp, let's work now. And I think that's kind of I've never been in a locker room, so I wouldn't know, but, I mean, it just seems like in the past, compared to now, the energy is way more tense and way more focused in on the season than ever. And that's because there's just a lot they got to do. This COVID is just going to be a huge obstacle that every team has to prepare for. And basically the best team that can handle COVID is going to win the Super Bowl. That might be what it is. It's not about the best talented, best culture. Yeah, it's about the team with the healthiest and players that handle COVID the best. That's probably what's going to happen. So, Hard Knocks, to finish this up, basically, very low energy. Still interesting. I'm always a fan of the show. I just still think there's good moments from every season. something funny, something stupid, something that you just look at and shake your head, something you question, something that will cost people their jobs. Herm Edwards. But anyway, it's glad that this year we're doing, or they're doing, a production on two really good coaches that I think should be held in the highest regard in terms of just leaders, how they lead their players. Anthony Lynn and Sean McVay. I mean, this is not Hugh Jackson or, my God, what's his name? From Atlanta. I mean, he was horrible. He couldn't get the guys to do anything. Mike Smith. I mean, those were just horrible seasons. You knew those teams were done. But, I mean, these two teams, at least they got a shot. I mean, the Rams, their roster's depleted. The Chargers, I think, are older and sort of going through a bit of a rebuild, if you ask me. But Anthony Lynn is just really straightforward with his players, head on. Meaning that I trust him. I trust his players. I would draft players on his team. I would draft Keenan Allen. I would draft Austin Eckler. I would draft, my God, I was about to say Vincent Jackson. What's his name? Mike Williams, maybe. And Herbert, you got to wait and see with him because they're probably going to start Tyrod and let Herbert develop, kind of thinking that they could redshirt him essentially and play him next year, hopefully when this stuff dies down. But the Rams, they got a long uphill battle, but at least Sean McVay's going about it the right way. He's giving his team every shot in the world. I mean, their quarterback is still Jared Goff. Their salary cap is still inflated. Their roster is still old, but it is what it is. Sean McVay's giving them a shot. So, as far as the TV show's going to go, I don't know what to expect. I just expect a lot of COVID precaution, how they're going to factor everything in, what the coaches' meetings are going to look like, what the evaluation is going to look like. Maybe you'll get a little bit of a peek at that. You're going to get to see, I guess, the energy of the locker room a little bit, just see how these players are, taking practice every day. Is this really going to wear them down and really just be overwhelming in terms of the concern just being mentioned every day? I mean, you see it and feel it and do it every day. So that's just stuff to really look out for. That's, I would say, minor, but at the end of the day, it's not really minor when you're talking about the same players that we're looking at drafting for fantasy football. But it's really going to help you next, guys. Let's take a break and get into this. We're going to get into how to build a draft board. Okay? How to build a draft board and how you use a draft board and what to do on draft day with your draft board. And then stick around. We're going to break down the rankings and some possible bounce back players after the break.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We are back on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. I know I messed that up consistently last time, but not today. GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, the podcast that investigates and educates fantasy football players. All right, let's get into something that you're definitely going to need to be educated on, and that's how to build a draft board. And most of you never built a draft board. All right, I know for a fact. Why? Because I play in a league where we pretty much draft all together. Like, we all meet up, we draft. This year is going to be probably a Zoom meeting, so we'll still clown each other and whatnot, but it's going to be virtual, a little bit different. So I've seen people show up to draft day with pieces I've seen them show up with old magazines, articles in hand, 50 tabs open on the computer. They got a pen out, they got paper out. Guys, that's cool, but that's not where you want to be. All right, these old magazines, come on. That stuff was written in April. What's that going to do for you now? Do you understand how many changes there's been since then? Like, why would you want something like that? You need to build a custom ranking draft board. Okay, and the custom rankings need to be around, number one, your scoring system in your league, whether it be PPR, standard, auction, whatever type of money league you have, and that's where, in a separate podcast, I'm really going to break down auctions and money leagues. That's just, there's so much to break down that's not going to be enough for now. But for those 90% of you are playing standard and PPR, which is basically easy to make a draft board. And if you make a draft board with your custom rankings combined with your scoring system, you honestly give you a better shot than 75% of the league, because they're not going to be organized. All right, when they're sitting there scrambling on the clock looking for a player, you sit there, you look at your list, you look at the best player on that list, and you pick them. That's all you got to do. Now, how do you make those custom rankings? A lot of you thinking like, man, 200 players or 100 players, like, that's insane. Like, yeah, I can't do that by myself. It's not hard. Literally type in, just go to ESPN.com, pull up any rankings, all right? Open a document or open a Google spreadsheet, which is ultimately what your board should be on, an Excel sheet, or just print it out, which that ain't a bad option. That's old school. That's what I do. I don't need my computer loading when I'm on the clock. I don't need loading. I don't have time for that. I need to be right here. Let's go. Let's get the picking. It's not, I mean, if this is 10 minutes on the clock like the NFL, I'd be sitting around chit-chatting, talking crap to other people in the league. But when it's a minute, that's not a lot of time, guys. And a minute speeds up when you're on the clock, believe it or not. So you got to be sharp. And I said that last podcast, and I'll probably say that every podcast until the season really starts. Which you still got to be sharp, but you have to be extra sharp during draft time, because this is where you spot mistakes and misevaluations by other teams and players in your league. So when you have a custom list and you import any random rankings, it doesn't matter, because what you're going to do is literally list those players 1 through, you really only need 100. If it's a 12 team, maybe go 150, but just swap the names around to the way that's a custom. Look for the depth charts, look for usage rates, look for the volume, right? That's what we talked about. You combine that. Combined with your scoring system. So if you're in a standard scoring system, you're going to have running back galore. Every running back, you're going to have about 10 running backs in your top 15 players at least. If you don't, then you're not doing your board correctly. All right? If you're a PPR league, you're going to have a little bit more of a shift. Rather than maybe an 80-20 running back favorite, you're going to have, I'd say, 70-30, 65-35 running back favorite. Running backs are still going to dominate any league. I don't care. Auction, fantasy scoring, you make up some custom scoring, unless the receivers are heavily favored. I mean, running backs are your engine. I explained that last podcast, and I'm going to say it today, and I'm going to still say it on the next podcast, and so forth. You have to build your team from the running back out. So best off that at least 80% of the players in your top 50 are running backs. And that seems high, but believe me, there's going to be a lot of players that are going to go quick. And there's only 32 starting running backs, and there's probably only 50 that are worth, I'd say, drafting, period. Just because then it gets to a point where, you can pick up a guy, but then he's probably not going to get enough burn for him to start. So he's just a bench warmer at most. And there's going to be opportunities for guys along the year with injuries, but if you're banking on an injury and another running back to come along, that's not really an efficient way to build your team. So always make sure that you're stacking those running backs early so you can get them early. Aside from that, there's really two ways to build your draft board. And there's the horizontal board and there's the vertical board. And this is something that's even used in professional football war rooms. And the horizontal board is basically your ranking of every position. So you're going to have your rankings for your quarterbacks, your rankings for your running backs, your rankings for your receivers, and your rankings for your tight ends. And essentially, the horizontal board is what we're going to be doing in the 10 quarterbacks, 10 receivers, 10 tight ends that I'm going to talk about in the later segment. That's basically your horizontal board. Now, the vertical board is the most challenging. Your vertical board is every player stacked up 1 through 200, 1 through 150, whatever, best player. And how you determine that is really going to determine your board. Now, I can't tell you player by player how it's going to determine, how one determines from the other. You got to make that judgment on your own. And how to make that judgment is, again, going back to the depth chart, going back to usage rates and targets, going back to, if this receiver is not getting many targets in an offense that's not favoring him, why would you put him early? Why would you put him over a running back that might get 200 carries a year, right? So it's stuff like that. Then combined with the system they're in, combined with the situation around them, combined with their upside. I mean, there's so many factors in, putting this together that it's going to set you apart in a way, because by the time you get to draft day, you're basically going to have, your board should look different than the consensus board is, right? So when you see that and you see the consensus board, you could use the consensus board to kind of game plan where you're going to pick your players. That's where we're going to talk about mock drafts and how you use mock drafts. That'll help you determine which players you got to take. But finishing off the vertical board talk, basically that's going to determine your whole team, your draft, is that vertical board. So if you got a sleeper that you think is going to be, 1,000-yard receiver, or 10 touchdown receiver, put him higher than what you put him where you think he belongs. Don't be afraid. This is your board. Okay? Don't go asking all these other people, oh, where should I put this guy, because then that's not your board. That's someone else's board. You have to make a judgment on yourself, on your own rankings, on what you like, on your usage rates, on target rates, whatever. That's going to make your draft. But the benefit to all this is organization. And that's something I briefly mentioned, but you need to be organized. You need to be organized, and you need to be organized like a freaking secretary come draft time. All right? Now, for me, I'm old school. So what I'm going to do on draft day is I'm going to literally have a list printed out. I'm literally looking at the list on a piece of paper, not on a computer sheet. And there's nothing wrong. You could definitely do it on Excel. I've done multiple drafts on Excel before, but listen, I do not want to be flip-flopping tabs when I'm on the clock. You do not want to be that guy. Okay, because if you do that, you're going to mess up a pick. I guarantee it. I guarantee it you'll mess a pick up. Because you're going to come down and you're just going to make a gut decision. When time's ticking, you're going to go with your gut. You're not going to go with an educated guess. Well, not even a guess or decision, whatever you want to call it. You get the point. All right? So when you come down to being on the clock, the number one thing you want to be is organized. And that's the reason you do the draft board. So as soon as every player gets picked, you simply cross that player's name out. Simple. I mean, what do you think NFL team? As soon as a player gets picked, they just take their tag off the board. Okay, he's on the board. So during that time, I mean, 90% of drafts don't do in-draft trades. We were considering doing it in one of my leagues. It would get hectic. We did before draft trades, and I'll tell you guys a story, maybe on a different podcast, of how I pulled off an absurd trade with draft picks. But it was really something that's just very seldom in fantasy leagues, very popular in NFL. But you could do rather than look at your rankings, is okay. When you see these players getting picked and you cross them out, you could go in your head, maybe I can wait around on this guy. Maybe I need to take this guy now. And if you can determine, maybe a guy that's best player on your board, maybe you can get him next round. And if that's the case, you take maybe the second best player, and then the next round you take your best player who you should have picked earlier. That's value. That's stealing. So when you go to do your own draft grade or whatever, that's an A+, because you stole. You stole value, but you got to be right on these players. That's the key. Because if you're right on your rankings with these players, you're going to win your league. You'll win your league. Okay, if you have next year's rankings today, you're going to win your league. So that's basically what it comes down to. It's just staying organized, staying on top of everything. Now, let's practice, right? How do you practice draft situations? Mock drafts. All right, great time. I mean, we're in quarantine, guys. Absolutely nothing going on. Practice mock drafts and go through mock drafts over and over. All right. First, before that, actually, is make sure you know what pick you're picking. All right. Go to your commissioner. Ask your commissioner, hey, what's my draft pick? And either they have it ready or they don't. But get your draft pick ASAP, because once you know your draft pick and where you're picking, with how many guys in the league or whatever, you go to ESPN.com, fantasy football mock drafts, and literally mock your draft like 10,000 times. All right? Do it 10,000 times. Like, obviously not literally, but still. You need to go through scenario after scenario after scenario after scenario. All right? Just keep going through it over and over and over. And it's almost like it's basically a game. Because once your brain is going to, by the time draft day comes around and you practice these scenarios over and over and over again, you're not going to be nervous, because you're going to know what to do. You're going to know which player to pick. Okay, I know I can get this guy now, and I'll take him, wait for him next round. You'll know because you practice. And I know every player's different. Every league is different in terms of just, the guys and what they like, if you know what I mean. But when we're talking fantasy, at the end of the day, most of the people in the league are going to have the same cookie-cutter rankings. It's just the case. All right? They don't have time for draft boards. They don't have time for doing these over and over and over. But if you want to win your league and have the edge, that's what you have to do. And it will give you an edge, believe me. I mean, right out the gate, if you have a good draft, you could literally look at other people's teams and you could cross off about 4 or 5 teams that have no shot of winning your fantasy football championship just because they didn't have good drafts. And, I mean, I did it in my league. I knew who was going to be good, who wasn't. You could tell. I mean, this is how you win your league. It's having a good draft. I think it's at least 50% of winning a championship is having an A-plus draft. And those are 2 ways to do it. But before we get into the break, I also wanted to talk about this app called Draft Wizard. They're not a sponsor, but my friend told me about him. And he's basically a fantasy football geek like me. I mean, he's in the same league as me. He told me it's an app called Draft Wizard. So if you have a tablet or an iPad, you can get it on your iPhone too, but it's probably not going to work as great, if you know what I'm saying, just because it's a mock draft. It has a simulator with 12 other people online. So with all that stuff going on your phone, you might want to just use a tablet. But what it's going to do is it'll have your rankings. You basically go through the mock draft, whatever type of mock draft, and it's going to give you a grade. And it'll give you, basically, it'll just give you your quote-unquote draft grade. Just like Mel Kiper gives draft grades, the computer will give you a draft grade of how you think it did in terms of your draft. So it's interesting to play around with. I did it a couple times. My grades weren't too high. They were similar to the grades I got in high school, but it was still an interesting exercise to do, and something that'll definitely make you a better fantasy football player. So in terms of what players you want in order of this draft board, stick around to the last segment, because we're going to get into the horizontal board, ranking these quarterbacks for good, and then we'll get into other positions and other podcasts. But stick around, folks, because we're going to get into that, and we're also going to get into next bounce back candidates for fantasy football 2020. Stay tuned.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Went over some strategies to help build your draft board and optimize your chance of having a really organized, sound, successful fantasy football draft, as well as some news around the league. We're going to get into some horizontal board rankings. That's really what I should call them now, the horizontal board rankings, now that I just explained to you the difference. And we'll start with quarterbacks for today. But now is the time that I want to get into bounce backs. And bounce backs are, it's a term that's really thrown around a lot. Basically, a bounce back to anyone is a guy who had a down year and now he's on the come up. Well, I want to adjust the definition. Bounce back is really a guy who was supposed to have an excellent season and he didn't. But this year, I think he's going to have a great season. Maybe not great, but definitely a lot better than the previous year. So that's really what I think about a true bounce back candidate. And let's wait no further. Number one, Saquon Barkley. All right, and I know a lot of this is due to injury. He got hurt and it really messed him up, which will with anybody, but it put him out of action for almost like 8 weeks, and it really never just looked the same when he came back. I mean, they tried to rush him back in the lineup, which never really made sense. He had a rookie quarterback. The offensive line is still the offensive line, so it really just wasn't going well for Saquon last year. But this year, it definitely will go well for him. And the number one reason it's going to go well for him is because of Jason Garrett. And a lot of you laugh when I say that name, but I'm going to tell you this, all right? I know a little bit about Jason Garrett, being a Cowboy fan for 15 years, all right? And Jason Garrett was there for almost 13 of them as the offensive coordinator and head coach. So I know a little bit about his offense and what he wants to do, and I'm going to tell you right now, he wants to run the ball. Okay? He's going to come in. He came into that New York Giants offense, and he said, look, fellas, we have one player that's worth anything, and that's Saquon Barkley. So if we're going to do anything on offense, we need to maximize Saquon Barkley, meaning invest in the offensive line. And finally, the Giants, rather than, Eric Flowers, who was useless, they invested in their 4th overall pick in an offensive tackle. They invested another 3rd-round pick in an offensive tackle. So Jason Garrett clearly came in and had a message to Dave Gettleman and Joe Judge, hey, fellas, we need to get physical offensive linemen. All right, guys that move people off the ball, guys that aren't slow like Bobby Hart, guys that aren't, not going to protect the quarterback. We need fast. No, I don't know about fast, but guys who have a great get-off, push, and agile. He wants guys that are athletic and can move linemen and go up to the 2nd level and even block a linebacker. Because if Saquon gets to the 2nd level, that's hard. Hard to bring him down. So that's why Jason Garrett, he's in there. Hey, fellas, this guy is hard to tackle. This guy is hard for other teams. We maximize him. Teams are going to have a hard freaking time stopping Barkley. And to be honest with you, I couldn't agree more, because the little bit I see of him, I just keep getting it more impressed. He's got a lot to work in pass protection, but for fantasy purposes, pass protection doesn't really mean anything. He's still going to be on the field. They signed Deion Lewis, even though he's really a 3rd down back. Obviously, I don't see him cutting into Barkley's rep. But Saquon is a prime bounce-back candidate. just due to what he's going around. Jason Garrett is going to feed him the rock. Daniel Jones is still developing, so you're definitely not going to see a lot of, air it out on offense. It's going to be ground heavy, because also with the Giants, before we move on to the next player, their horrible defense, they're going to want to keep that defense off the field as much as possible. So Barkley, if he isn't a top 5 player in fantasy for you, you don't know what you're doing. You can make a case for him at 1. Honestly, if you pick him 1, I'm going to be mad at you. He's easily going to have a good year. I'm very confident saying that. Now let's move on to number 2. And number 2 is going to be Saquon's running back best friend, the man we picked on a lot last podcast, Le'Veon Bell. And Le'Veon Bell had a rough year last year. Why? Well, the biggest reason was he didn't have Pouncey in front of him. He didn't have David DeCastro. He didn't have Villanueva. He had the Jets' offensive line. And the Jets' offensive line is what you expected. It basically represents the Jets. They're slow. Right? They're slow. They don't get off the ball. They don't move anybody. They're not physical. I mean, that offensive line did nothing but hurt Sam Darnold and make the ground game inefficient. So Le'Veon Bell was just basically stranded last year. He did not have any weapons around him. Any. Receiver, tight end, line, quarterback. He had nothing. I'll give him that, because he had a lot to go through. But, and you also, on top of that, too, let's not forget Adam Gase didn't want him. Adam Gase didn't want to sign him. The previous general manager that was there wanted to sign him. Adam Gase was just kind of stuck with him. That's why reports are coming out. Gase is, maybe we should get rid of this guy. I don't really want him. And this is during the time when Gase was the quote-unquote interim general manager. So he had the power to do that if he wanted to. But he chose not to. Now this year it seems like he's, buying in more. It's like, hey, let's maximize this guy while we got him. Darnold's going to be back. We finally invested in offensive linemen. I mean, my God, we've been begging the Jets to freaking pick an offensive tackle. About time. And they got a good one in Mekhi Becton. I like him a lot. He's huge. He moves. I mean, this is a guy that will move you off the ball, and he's physical. This is what an offensive tackle should look like. So, good pick by Joe Douglas and crew. Even though he hasn't played yet, I'm confident he'll do well. So you move him in, and they sign some free agents. That could put Bell back at 1,000 yards easily. But I think the second year with Gase, the second year with Darnold, it's really going to help him a lot. And I think that he's going to return to the form, I don't want to say like the 2015 Steeler form where he was having like 1,500 yards a year, but he should get 1,000 yards. At least 1,000 all-purpose, because he can get about 300-400 receiving. He's a good receiver. So I say 1,000 rushing, 1,400 all-purpose is a realistic expectation for Le'Veon Bell. And as far as a vertical board where he goes, he's probably a top 30 player still, just because he's so talented. But as long as there's no friction with him and the head coach, and the line can go in like I think they can and fix it up, I think he'll go back to where he belongs. Next on the list is Kareem Hunt. Kareem Hunt. Now, his image is basically tainted from the domestic violence incident, which is absolutely disgusting. I get it. So, John Dorsey, who's a former general manager of the Cleveland Browns and Kansas City Chiefs, he's a general manager that doesn't care about character. So, he drafted in Kansas City. There's a lot of kids that he drafted that had some big character concerns. Chris Jones, the defensive tackle. He was phenomenal in college at Mississippi State. He was phenomenal. But the coaches were not signing off on him. That's why he went to the second round, and the Chiefs ended up scooping him up. Now, they're lucky they have a coach like Andy Reid, who has a culture that's basically stronger than any player. Same with Belichick. So you could bring in these guys, and it'll probably be a good fit. That's why Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill was, he had the domestic violence too. Travis Kelce wasn't. He was a third-round pick. I mean, he had some character concerns too. Obviously, he wasn't a third-round player. I mean, he was a great player, but he fell late longer than he should have. And a couple other players on their team as well. But the point is, he signed him to the Browns last year while he was general manager. Expected him to come in and, maybe contribute, be a backup for Nick Chubb. And he was suspended 8 games, and when he came back, he wasn't great, but he wasn't bad. And what they did with him is really use him as a receiver. They really used Chubb as the workhorse, running back, run him up the middle. And third down, they put Kareem in. Now, overall, Kareem might be the better player than Nick Chubb. That's what this new coaching staff with Kevin Stefanski, they have to figure that out. Because if they determine that they don't care about Nick Chubb, they didn't draft him. Okay, like that's what you guys got to understand. If there's a new coaching staff, that depth chart, you don't know what it's going to be right now, because when it's a new staff, they want it their way. They don't want it the previous way. So there's some players that might have been a starter on the previous regime. They're not going to be starters. And I don't think he beats out Nick Chubb, but I do think he has a bounce back year. They said he was top 14 in receiving towards the end from his 8 games in the end of the year, and that Kareem Hunt was the second highest graded receiving back by Pro Football Focus. So in a PPR league, you're definitely going to want to take a look at Kareem Hunt in the late rounds. He's basically going undraftable, and to be honest with you, for the price of a bag of chips, it's honestly worth the pickup, because if Nick Chubb gets hurt, which has happened, if he gets hurt, that's a player you want on your team. Because we know what Kareem Hunt is. He led the league in rushing, guys, 3 years ago. I know that's crazy, but he led the league in rushing 3 years ago. And he was really good as a receiver, too. He's a do-it-all back that is really just on the bench and has a tainted image due to his off-the-field problems. But great player. If they integrate him the way I think they can, I think he'll have a bounce-back year. But Chubb, too, I think Chubb's going to be a good... I mean, Stefanski's in heaven, because I think that's what big reason he took that job is he knows what he could do with his style, which is a run-first style, and he knows what he can do with those 2 backs and the O-line they got. So I think he's really, really fired up about getting in there and getting to work. But let's move on to number 4, and we're going to talk about Matty Ice. And Matty Ice has basically been on a steady decline, I want to say. I mean, it's been a decline, then an uphill, then decline, and uphill. I mean, he's been all over the place since that Super Bowl. All right, so we had the 2016 season. He won the MVP with Kyle Shanahan, which was a great year for him. He looked outstanding. Then they brought in Sarkisian. Sarkisian was all right. Didn't really gel with them the way they wanted to, and they got rid of him. And then now they brought back Dirk Cotter, who was a coach of the Bucs, and he was their coordinator before. My guess is that's, Ryan's accustomed to him and they like his system, so they're going to bring him in and let him run the offense. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'll tell you this. With the weapons he has, I know he doesn't have Austin Hooper. They got Hayden Hurst. Julio's still Julio. Calvin Ridley's still there. Sadu's not there anymore, but they brought in, what's his name? I can't even think of his name right now. I'd say Matt Ryan throws for 30 touchdowns. Is that fair? I don't think he gets 40, 50. I don't think he'll get that. But I say 30 touchdowns and close to 4,000 yards. This guy isn't getting drafted. Nobody's picking Matty Ice. Okay? Nobody's focused on that. So my point being, why is he a bounce back? Because if you can get this guy in the 12th round as your quarterback too, that's like nothing. That's like investing nothing for something. Okay, you basically used a pick on a guy who's could go to the waiver wire next week if you wanted to, and he could be your starter the whole year. I mean, Matty Ice is known for putting up these consistent 300-yard game, 3-touchdown games, which you want with the fantasy quarterback. Now, I see a lot of people this year. They're trying to find the next rushing quarterback. They want a Lamar right back, and Lamar's special, guys. Okay, there's no next Lamar. All right, I know a lot of people are looking for the next Lamar. There is no next Lamar, okay? Kyler Murray is not the next Lamar. Maybe he is, and I don't know, but I don't see it. All right? So wait on your quarterback. Remember one of the principles I talked about last week. Wait on your quarterback, and this could be one of the guys you wait for because he's not even getting drafted. This is a guy that you got to take a look at. He's a veteran quarterback, been around for a while, and he knows how to get the job done through the air. So that's number 4. 2 more I want to go over real quick, and they're both wide receivers. Number 1, Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, we clown on Juju a little bit for being, one of the popular players, being an SC kid. He's got the spotlight on him and whatnot. Played with Antonio Brown for a year, looked outstanding. Then didn't look too hot. Came off a little bit of a down year. Then last year was just horrible for him. I mean, he had a couple good games, but he was not Juju. Like, the juice for Juju wasn't there in those games. I don't know what it was, but Juju just wasn't what he was projected to be. He was projected to be a top, I want to say, 25 fantasy player. Receiver, he was projected top 10 easily. But he was projected, I remember seeing him get drafted like 20 overall in my league. And I'm sitting there with Tyreek Hill on the clock. I'm going, what are you doing? But this year, Juju, number one, he's got Big Ben back. That's going to help a lot. I mean, the Steelers did not have a quarterback last year. All right, Mason Rudolph is horrible. And Duck, I love you, dude, but you're not a quarterback. All right, so basically he was getting the ball thrown from a nobody 80% of the time. Then you look at the fact that, teams are game planning for him now. So the Steelers really didn't have anybody. I mean, they have James Washington, but he's more just a vertical threat. I don't think teams are really, shivering at night when they hear his name. Or, they got Deontay Johnson, who they drafted last year. I think a lot of people were expecting him to break out. But with the better quarterback, his quarterback, Big Ben, coming back, you're expecting these kids to break out. You're expecting a healthy James Conner combined with Benny Snell. We know what the offensive line is going to be for Pittsburgh. Hey, why not bet on him? Okay, and Juju is going late. That's why I have him as a bounce back. He's going late. And I mean late. Like, I've seen him go round 8 as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. Now, if you get him as your wide receiver 4, you're just stealing. If you get him as a 3, you're probably stealing. But I think this kid might be a 2. He might be a 2. If he can get 1,000 yards being the starter, I think that's very possible with the way Big Ben was able to move the football. He's able to get in the end zone at least 6-7 times. That's like solid wide receiver 2. And you can easily get it. I think you can get him as a 3 this year, guys. In a 10, 12-man league, you can probably get him as a 3. And that ain't a bad option at all. So keep a look at Juju. And then the last player I want to briefly mention is N'Keal Harry. And I talked about him earlier. Now, he might not fit into the bounce-back definition, like clear-cut, if you know what I'm saying. But the reason I put him here is because he was projected to be the number 1 receiver for New England last year. I mean, he went into a room that was Julian Edelman, who's aging, Josh Gordon, who doesn't have any juice left, Philip Dorsett, who doesn't have any juice left. What's his name? Not Chris Hogan. And I know not Amendola. The other kid. And he was, bottom line, he's projected to be the number 1 receiver there. And it didn't happen. A lot of it was due to injury, though. So I think this year for him, coming back in, second year in the system, new quarterback that he could bond with. Okay, it's hard as a 22-year-old kid. I know you're a first-round pick, but it's hard to go up to Tom Brady and tell him what you like. I mean, Tom Brady's the GOAT around there. So you might be pressured, but this kid will go up to Cam Newton. Hey, man, they'll become buddies, and if Cam Newton starts liking this kid, he's going to throw him the ball a lot. And that might be a wide receiver 1 before the year's dead. But with the way he's getting drafted, he's not even getting drafted, guys. Nobody's talking about him. So scoop him up at round 9 if you can, round 10. Make him your wide receiver 4. Don't plan on starting him early, but definitely this is a kid you could stash because, heck, with the way Belichick and that organization raved about him last year before he got hurt, there's a good shot this kid could be a number 1. So those are my prime bounce-back candidates. Guys, stick around. Last segment, we're going to get into the horizontal board and top 10 quarterbacks. We're going to go over the quarterback rankings in depth, put the nail in the coffin to this whole debate around the quarterbacks, who's the best and whatnot, coming right up after the break.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Back from the break, and here's the moment you've been waiting for, guys. We're going to get right into it. Top 10 quarterbacks vertical board, or excuse me, horizontal board that you can use in order on your vertical board. So basically, these top 10 are based. I've gone through so many top 10s. This is like nothing in terms of just trying to rank these quarterbacks. But this is for fantasy. All right. So when I say this name for number 10, don't think this is real life. This is fantasy. For 2020 fantasy, my top 10 quarterbacks. And most of you get it. So, number 10, we're going to dive right in. Aaron Rodgers. Now, the reason Rodgers isn't really the 3 or the 2 like he was in previous years is just that offensive explosiveness isn't there anymore. He doesn't really have, he has Devontae Adams, but he doesn't really have that secondary third threat like he used to when you had guys like James Jones and Donald Driver and Greg Jennings and Jordy Nelson, Randall Cobb, etc. But he doesn't have that. He doesn't really have a marquee tight end. I know they kicked the tires with Jimmy Graham for a while. It took him so long for them to realize he wasn't a good player anymore. But Rodgers is just really fighting an uphill battle. He's ultimately just playing non-turnover football because his defense last year got a lot of turnovers, which is the reason they won a lot of games. A lot of people don't talk about that. But if you look at his statistics last year, he only threw about 25 touchdowns, but he only threw about 2 picks. And in fantasy, you'd probably rather opt for a guy like Jameis, who, he's going to throw 30 picks, but he's going to lead the league in passing and throw at least 30 touchdowns. All right, for real life, you obviously take the Aaron Rodgers. But fantasy, you'd rather opt for the high end. That's why I have Rodgers down low. The reason I think he cracked the top 10 over a lot of other guys is just his ultimate consistency. You can start him. You know you're going to get a good game. You know Rodgers is not going to fumble the bag for you. He's one of those guys that he's still going late in terms of like a 7th, 8th round. But he's been around the while, veteran quarterback. You know he's going to get the job done. So still a very solid option and a quarterback that I have really hated, but at the same time I've came to respect. Number 9 on the list is the same type of player who is a veteran quarterback, knows how to get the job done, but just isn't all the way up there for fantasy, and that's Drew Brees. Now, Drew Brees is very, very similar to Aaron Rodgers. We look at Drew Brees' case. Even in 2018, which I think was that best Saints team, when they went 13-3, they lost the game in the Rams with the pass interference. Drew Brees only threw for 32 touchdowns that year. It wasn't like 40 or 50. It was 32, and he had only about 5 interceptions. So still, you take that on your fantasy team. Don't get me wrong. But that's when Drew Brees was, people were saying that's where Drew Brees was at his best fantasy-wise and his peak shape. So if that's his peak, he's not going to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback. But again, Rodgers, Brees is a guy, every year he's round 8, round 9. You can get him easy because teams don't want to take Drew Brees. They know what they're going to get. They want to take a guy like Kyler Murray, who they think is the next Lamar. They want to take a Patrick Mahomes or whatnot. So these are guys that they're veterans, but they get the job done. The reason I give Drew Brees the edge over Rodgers is because of his system. And Sean Payton, I mean, he just has a way to just, I mean, Skip Bayless talks about this, and I don't think Skip Bayless is smart at all. But the one thing I'll agree with Skip Bayless is he says that Sean Payton, he brings these guys off the street, and tomorrow they're running wide open. I mean, how many times do you watch a Saints game and there's some who they brought off the street, he's running wide open, nobody's on him. This is like 5 yards of separation. You're like, who is this guy? Like these guys like Dan Arnold and I don't even know some of these guys' names that they brought in. I mean, they just come out of nowhere. But Sean Payton has a way of just figuring it out offensively, which is why I put him and Drew Brees above Aaron Rodgers. Number 8, we're going to touch this briefly because we just talked about him a lot. Matt Ryan. We talked about his high octane passing offense. How they don't really have a rushing offense anymore, guys. It's a pass first offense. They want to air it out with Ryan. They want to use Julio as much as possible. Use Ridley as his number 2, and just light the torch up. That's what they want to do. They don't care about the running game anymore. They cut Freeman. They brought in Gurley, but Gurley has no juice in his legs, so Gurley's not going to last a full game. You can't give Gurley the ball 20 times a game anymore. You just can't do that. So I don't think Atlanta's really going to be, once they see what Gurley is, they're not going to be really focused on run. They're just going to be air it out. And Matt Ryan's the one throwing the ball. He's got the durability. So odds are, even if it's a kid they're bringing up off the street or Julio Jones, he's going to get points. I really do think he's going to get points. And the second year with Dirk Cotter bringing him back, I think that'll, his system will resonate back with the offense like it did before. Most of those players are new when he went in the first time, except for the key players like Ryan, Julio, and those guys up front. But I still would prefer Matt Ryan just because I know what I'm getting on that offense, and that's air it out. The Saints, they have a run game. The Packers have a run game. The Falcons don't. So that's why I like Matty Ice. Number 7. This is a little weird. A lot of you guys, and I don't like this quarterback either, but I like him in fantasy, Josh Allen. Now, a lot of you don't know this, but I was looking at this the other day. Go ahead and Google Josh Allen's rushing stats. Did you know Josh Allen had 600 yards last year rushing? Did you know that? I didn't either. I go, okay. He had 6 rushing touchdowns and 600 rushing yards. So, again, this goes back to my point earlier about Lamar. When you add a quarterback with that much rushing ability to your team, that's almost like adding an extra slot in your lineup. So, as bad as his completion percentage is, as bad as some of his balls down the field are, with the athlete he is, he's going to get yards, a lot of yards, rushing and passing. And if he gets to 30 rushing yards a game, guys, with a rushing touchdown, that's 10 points. So that ain't bad. That ain't bad at all. And you look at Buffalo, they're improving offensively. They've improved every year. They signed Beasley. Now they finally went out and got the real deal, Stephon Diggs, to pair with him. And John Brown, who's also came on for them last year. They got Dawson Knox at tight end. They're really implementing a running game to give them some balance. So Buffalo's really starting to figure it out. Shout out to Sean McDermott for getting that extension. I know he hasn't beaten Belichick yet, but considering some of the coaches they hired in the past, like the Rex Ryans and guys like that, they give Sean McDermott gives them a way better chance than they've ever had before. So I agree with that contract. Why not? But that's what I like about Josh Allen. I think Josh Allen, with his athleticism and combined with if he can get 250 yards and improve a little bit last year passing-wise, might be a good player. Now, let's move into the real quarterbacks. Number 6, Russell Wilson. Now, Russell Wilson, the only thing that wouldn't put me at number 1 in fantasy is just because he doesn't have the line. I get it. Russell's got a great receiving core with Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf. His tight ends are good. His running game is good, but, man, that line just scares me. They don't invest much, and the guys they do pick aren't very good. So offenses with bad lines just don't appeal to me. And Russell's such a good player that he easily cracks the top 10. He's so consistent every year. You know what you're going to get from him. that you have to put him at 6. And he gets the rushing like we talked about with Allen. So he's not going to surpass the guys we're about to talk about just due to his line and the system around him. But my God, great player, and in real life, he might be the best. Let's finish this off real quick. We'll go up to number 5, and that is Mr. Tom Brady. Now, Tom Brady was throwing for 112 passer rating in the Patriots, guys. I mean, last year was a bad year for him, but again, he finds a way to get the job done. You want Hall of Fame quarterback. I mean, Rodgers, Breeze, Wilson, Brady. Every year they're going to be on the list just because they're Hall of Fame quarterbacks. And Hall of Fame quarterbacks get the job done. Those are guys you want. You want consistent players. You want guys that you know you can count on. So you always take the consistency over the upside, in my opinion. So with Brady, you think out on paper, he upgrades his receivers, right? His tight end is Rob Gronkowski, his best tight end ever. His offense, they upgraded the offensive line. They put a first-round pick in the O-line as well as signed another guy. What can go wrong offensively? They don't really use a running game in Tom Brady's offense anyway, which is it's his offense. Make no mistake about it. He's doing in Tampa what Peyton's doing in Denver. That's what he's trying to do. So he's going to run the show, and I honestly think this show is going to be tailor-made for him. So that's why, as old as he is, he has an edge over a lot of these guys just due that the players he has around him is going to fit with, and the system, most importantly, is going to be his system. So there is no excuse to not do well. With Mike Evans, with Chris Godwin, with Rob Gronkowski, there's no excuse not to do well. So Tom Brady, I think, is going to have a bounce-back year for sure. He should have been on that list, but there really is no bad year for Tom Brady, for being honest. So we'll put him at number 5. Number 4, we're going to go with my boy Dak Prescott. Now, Dak Prescott has everything in the world you can ask for. The O-line. I know they lost Frederick, but I think they're going to do a good job replacing his center. Receivers, best in the league. Running back, one of the best in the league. What else can you... I mean, you got Blake Jarwin at tight end, my sleeper, too. So, if you're Dak, you got the rushing. Dak is just... He's the perfect balance of whatever you want. So, I was talking about him last time getting 30 touchdowns with 10 or less interceptions. And then you combine that with his 5 rushing touchdowns that he gets every year. You're looking at a 35 touchdown quarterback, guys. That's top 5. That's easily top 5. And I think with the new head coach in this system, I don't want to drag it out too long about how good I think he's going to be, but you might want to bet on him for MVP. Number 3 on the list is a quarterback that I was going to put 4, but I just respect him too much, and that's Deshaun Watson. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, you put Deshaun Watson there, but the system isn't favoring him. He has Bill O'Brien. He stinks. Guys, Bill O'Brien doesn't stink, all right? Don't listen to the media. Bill O'Brien has been in the playoffs every year as Houston Texans head coach, except for 1 year, and that was the year that the year they didn't have a quarterback. Deshaun Watson went down. He's been in the playoffs every year as a head coach. That's a good head coach. You're not a bad head coach if you go to the playoffs every year. You're a bad head coach like Jason Garrett. If you go 1 year, miss the next, go 1 year, miss the next, that's bad. That's inconsistent. If you're consistently getting your team to the playoffs, heck, you got a shot every year. So don't let this, nonsense that, O'Brien stinks. Now, you could say he stinks as a general manager for trading DeAndre Hopkins, but heck, if it's a character issue, it's a character issue. You don't want that crap lingering around. So he got rid of it just like Belichick would have, who was his number 1 mentor. Then you factor in the receivers they brought in to replace him. They brought in Randall Cobb. They brought in Brandon Cooks. They brought in, what's his name? Kenny Stills, that is his name. I was going to say Kenny Fuller, but that's Will Fuller. You look at these 5 guys that they have, what can go wrong with a quarterback like Deshaun Watson? The only thing that I could see going wrong is the offensive line. But man, I mean, with Watson and Prescott both wanting to get paid, which is another big factor, and Watson hasn't gotten paid either yet, guys, and he's up for contract. So Watson, Prescott, bet on those guys to win the MVP because one of them might. And when I told you about the refrigerator analogy, guys, when that refrigerator's empty, you become a little bit hungry. So let's finish off the episode with 2-1. Obviously, this is really the consensus in every fantasy rankings. And number 2 is Pat Mahomes. What can go wrong? Obviously, 50 touchdowns, MVP, Super Bowl champ. Andy Reid is your head coach. Tyreek Hill is your receiver. Travis Kelce. Guys, do we got to talk about it anymore? It's Pat Mahomes. Number 1, Lamar Jackson. For fantasy, the rushing is unbelievable. Does he repeat the same statistics? I don't think so. But I'll tell you what, if he gets 800 rushing with 30 touchdowns, with probably maybe 7 or 8 on the ground, still almost 40 touchdowns a year, guys. And he's a quarterback that doesn't really turn it over much, which is surprising. So 40 touchdowns all purpose makes you the number 1 quarterback in the league, in my opinion. Mahomes threw for around 30 last year, and he missed 3 games, I think. So he would have been up in that 40 discussion too. He had the 50 touchdown season. I don't think he'll ever repeat that, even though that was a godly year for him. But guys who were just going to average 40 touchdowns rushing or rushing or passing, you're considered a number 1 quarterback. And those are probably the only 2 quarterbacks that you invest a top or a round 7 or higher draft pick in. All the other guys just wait. It's not worth taking a quarterback early, guys. I've gone over this multiple times, but most importantly, put those guys on your horizontal board and try to figure out where you want to rank these guys. I'd say after that top 4 or 5 or 6 of guys after Wilson, you don't really need to worry about the rest. Pick up the rest as you want because they're all going to be there where you want to pick them. Josh Allen will be there. Drew Brees will be there. Aaron Rodgers will be there. Don't really worry about that too much, but write that down for the horizontal board because once you get all these rankings down in the next episodes, that's where you're going to be able to put your own vertical board together with your own preferences, and that's how you're going to stay organized, guys. So it's been a pleasure talking with you. This is Emmet Wyman, GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Stick around. We're going to have an episode next Wednesday giving you guys even more tips to prepare for the draft. It's draft season, and most importantly, it's football season, guys. So, glad you've been listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. Stick around next week because we got a lot of information to get into, and football's really going to get going, and dry season's over. So, thanks for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. Please go over to Apple Podcasts, our Twitter page, GSMC Fantasy Football. Follow the page, guys. We're going to be uploading some content there. That's where you can find this podcast on the Spreaker Network. Put a comment in. Put a reply in. Message us. Let me know what you think of the podcast. Let me know if we can improve on anything. Let me know if you want us to talk about anything. You have any questions. But please, feedback is welcome. Okay, I want feedback. I want to know what you think of this podcast and if this is helpful because if it is, it's going to make my day. It's going to want me to give you even more information. So it helps all of us out at the GMSC Podcast Network for you putting a comment in. Head over there. Head over to the socials, guys. Like it up. Run it up. And I'll see you next Wednesday. I'm out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.